Mike told me this was going to be outdoors, so I figured I'd have to wear a hat because of the sun. Well, we have this canopy, as you can see. So thanks, Mike, for making that work. I want to thank Mike. This is the third time he's invited me to speak in 2 different states. And in spite of that, he keeps asking me. So I'm very, very appreciative of that. And as someone who thinks daily about the U.S. colored troops, and again, that was the name that the federal government gave the close to 180,000 men who served representing African Americans, and as we've heard earlier, representing all Americans in the Civil War era. Mike has asked me to speak about the national movement to recruit and commission and supply African American soldiers in the Civil War, but I thought it might be useful to start at the local level. According to the 1860 census, Alabama had 435,000 enslaved persons. Your state in 1860 had over 435,000 enslaved persons. This constituted a staggering 45% of the state's 1860 population. So this is the local context of what I'm going to be talking about. Roughly 84,000 of those enslaved persons in Alabama were aged 18 to 45. So that's the sort of age range of the men who are going to serve in the U.S. colored troops, although as Mike certainly knows, and many of you as well, many African American and Caucasian American soldiers in the Civil War were much younger than 18. Alabama, your state, was credited with sending close to 5,000 men in the U.S. colored troops, the subject of my lecture today. And thanks again, Mike, for inviting me. African Americans in the Civil War era understood what historians understand now, that emancipation and the use of black men as armed soldiers were defining moments in the history of the race. Writing in September 1863, G.E. Hoistons, who became a non-commissioned officer in the famous 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Regiment, wrote that arming his fellow blacks would erase what he called that semblance of inferiority of our race, which cruel slavery has created. He predicted that if there is one spark of manhood running in the blood of the race that has resisted the waves of oppression, the school of the soldier will fan it to a glowing flame. 13 years later, during the American Centennial, the Civil War veteran and pioneer black historian George Washington Williams celebrated in his words, "When the life of our nation hung upon the thread of uncertainty, the slave threw down his hoe, took up his musket, and saved the country." Williams was certain that when the history of this country is written in truth, when freedom counts her jewels and reviews her glorious army of martyrs, the Negro will be there. This, according to a modern historian, was the emancipationist vision of the American Civil War, and the Negro was there. Over the last 4 decades, historians have made great strides in integrating this emancipationist view of the war into mainstream Civil War scholarship. They have documented, narrated, and analyzed the military service of the almost 180,000 African American armed soldiers who fought against the Confederates, suppressing their rebellion, destroying slavery, and putting then the African Americans on a path toward citizenship. The corpus of modern scholarship together with Edward Zwick's powerful 1989 film Glory, which I'm sure many of you have seen, has raised scholarly and public consciousness to the vital role and varied experiences of African American soldiers in the Union war effort. Blacks alone did not win the war, according to one authority, but timely and extensive support from them contributed significantly and may have made the difference between a Union victory and stalemate or defeat. Scholars today generally agree that African Americans tipped the delicate balance of power squarely in favor of the North. During the war, President Abraham Lincoln's critics, most notably the famous black abolitionist Frederick Douglass, faulted Lincoln loudly for his lethargy in freeing and arming the slaves. And many 20th century scholars followed suit, including me when I was young and didn't know too much. My research, however, suggests that Lincoln charted a far more linear course than his 19th century critics and modern historians have recognized. Although others, including abolitionists, Union generals, and Northern politicians, prodded and pushed Lincoln to emancipate the slaves and to mobilize black soldiers. For the first year and one half of the war, Lincoln was determined to keep the Union intact, as he said, with or without slavery. Lincoln acted cautiously and judiciously, convinced finally in late 1862, that emancipation and military recruitment of black men were vital, were essential to suppress the slaveholders' rebellion. Lincoln set in motion the process of liberating slaves in rebel territory and mustering into service black men in the North, in the occupied South, and eventually the loyal slave states. By war's end, black men comprised between 9 and 10% of all Union troops who served in the war. Again, between 9 and 10% of all Union troops who fought in what we sometimes refer to as the Brothers' War. In 1863, the African American regiments became federalized, hence the term the U.S. Colored Troops, the USCT. By 1865, Lincoln had raised about 180,000 African American soldiers. These men were organized in 133 infantry regiments, 4 independent companies, 7 cavalry regiments, 12 regiments of heavy artillery, and 10 companies of light artillery. Approximately 19% of the men came from the 18 northern states, 24% from the 4 loyal slave states, and this will interest you the most, I suppose, and 57% from the 11 Confederate states. So 57% of the men who served in the U.S. colored troops came from the Confederate states that were fighting against the Union. Although most of the black soldiers in blue were ex-slaves, more than 15% of the 1860 northern free black population joined the Union Army. So, more than half, most of the black soldiers in blue had been enslaved. More than 15% of the 1860 northern free black male population joined the Union Army. All in all, African Americans accounted for between 9 and 10% of all Union troops who served in the war. 16 of Lincoln's black soldiers in blue received the Medal of Honor. It wasn't then called the Congressional Medal of Honor. That came later. 16 of the black troops received the Medal of Honor, awarded to U.S. soldiers for the first time in 1863. Now, who were the men who volunteered to fight in the USCT? The early recruits, not surprisingly, came largely from the northern states. According to Norwood Hallowell, he was colonel of the 55th Massachusetts Volunteer Regiment, the sister regiment of the more famous 54th. The regiments recruited from the free states, these are his words, contained every known variety of citizen of African descent and were recruited from every class and condition of colored society, close quote. Hallowell compiled statistics, which have been very useful for me. He compiled statistics on his regiment, the 55th Massachusetts, one that he considered typical of units recruited in the North. And as you'll soon find out, the recruits were a diverse lot. Of the 961 enlisted men in the 55th, the largest number, 222, came from Ohio, followed by Pennsylvania, Virginia, Indiana, Kentucky, Missouri, and Illinois. The remaining 207 men were born in 18 states, including 11 slave states: the District of Columbia, Nova Scotia, Canada, that might surprise you, what was referred to as Africa, very vaguely, and then this other group, unknown. Collectively, the men had plied 46 different trades and occupations prior to coming into the U.S. colored troops. This probably won't surprise you. The most common profession, what do you think the most common profession was?
Farming.
You got, what a smart group, Mike. You don't need me. Send me back to Charlotte. The most common profession, of course, were farmers, followed by a very poorly defined group, laborers, waiters. Most of the waiters in the northern cities, Boston, Cleveland, New York, Chicago, were African Americans, waiters. A free black was a very common occupation. Another one, cooks, teamsters, sailors, masons and plasterers, now called drywall people, and hostler and shoemakers. The recruits served in 35 other occupations. These are interesting, I think, ranging from broom maker to glass grinder to confectioner. They made sweets. The men included 247 former slaves. These are the men that were in the 55th Massachusetts. 247 former slaves, 550 so-called pure blacks. When soldiers were enlisted, whites recorded vital statistics on them, including their skin color, pure blacks. Others were referred to as mulattoes. I wrote a book called Black Judas on an African-American war hero who wound up not to be such a hero, hence his name became infamous and was referred to by fellow African-Americans as Black Judas. He was called on his enlistment papers a yellow-skinned mulatto, a yellow-skinned mulatto. 430 of the so-called mixed blood, 477 men were literate. 477 men were literate. 319 men could read and write. There were 52 church members, and 219 of the men were married. The average age of the recruits was 23 1/5 years old, and their average height was 5 feet 7/12 inches. This was the time that medical science measured everything in great detail. The men had only one thing decidedly in common. They entered camp uniformly poor and ragged. Colonel Hallowell explained that once mustered into service, white officers and the commissioned officers who worked with African Americans, who supervised them, were all Caucasian. There were roughly, by the end of the American Civil War, about 100 commissioned African American soldiers. That means second lieutenant on the way up to major. But most of those people didn't, well, all of them, none of them had line officer responsibilities. They were recruiters and then worked in the Freedmen's Bureau during Reconstruction. Hallowell explained that mustered into service white officers employed two different methods of training the black recruits. In regiments such as the 54th and the 55 Massachusetts units, composed largely of free black men, commanders resorted to strict discipline, commonly used in drilling whites. If you remember the movie Glory, there was quite a bit of attention to that, the strict discipline. And of course, that was a northern regiment, the 54th, so there were mostly free blacks there. According to Colonel Hallowell, the unruly members of the 54th and 55th were stood on barrels, they were bucked, gagged, and if need be, shot. In fact, treated as white soldiers were in all the well-disciplined northern regiments. In contrast, Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson's 1st South Carolina Volunteers, these men were former slaves, and accordingly, Colonel Higginson, he employed a more, quote, enlightened method to train his men. He wrote, "In a slave regiment, the harsher forms of punishment were, or ought to have been, unknown, so that every suggestion of slavery might be avoided." Obviously, with slaves, enslaved men, they knew all too well about harsh discipline. Colonel Hallowell believed that whether free black or former slave, once the recruit received his new uniform, he became a new man. He straightened up, grew inches taller, lifted, not shuffled his feet, began at once to try, and to try hard, to take the position of the soldier. For the first time in his life, the black man found himself respected and entrusted with duties, for the proper performance of which he would be held to a strict accountability under the command of competent white commanders, Hallowell wrote, like himself. Each black volunteer became a possible Lord Chesterfield, an incredible warrior. Frederick Douglass said it better, and many of you know this quote. "Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S. Let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket, and there is no power on earth or under the earth which can deny that he has earned the right of citizenship in the United States." And as many of you know, Frederick Douglass' two sons both served, one in the 54th and the other in Colonel Hallowell's unit, the 55th Massachusetts Volunteer Regiment. Notwithstanding such hopes, ideals, and puffery, the black soldiers in the Union Army endured numerous hardships and indignities. These included half wages, inferior medical care, inadequate weapons, inappropriate rations, insufficient training, the prospect of being enslaved or executed if captured by the rebels, repeated insults from white troops, brutal punishments that smacked of slave discipline, abuse by their white officers, and many more that were not recorded. Because of the racist, limited experience and expectations by white officers of the black person's abilities as soldiers, here's a quote from General William T. Sherman, which you've probably heard of before. Direct quote, "I would use Negroes as surplus," he said in 1864. The men of the U.S. colored troops largely garrisoned forts, guarded confiscated plantations, guarded prisoners and railroad lines, escorted wagon trains, and performed the back-breaking fatigue and pioneer labor euphemistically termed engineering companies. But the black troops knew better, often complaining that the Army had assigned them to slave labor. And of course, the USCT, who fought behind us, behind me at this point, they knew better. They weren't fatigue laborers. They weren't garrison troops. They were soldiers, armed soldiers.